2 years ago now, a popular YouTuber in the gaming space made a video. Rockstar's game design is outdated. The game that was most under the lens of critique was Red Dead Redemption 2, and the central thesis of the video was all about Legos. The preset instruction of Legos versus the rubber tote of do whatever you want with these Legos. I've thought about this video for months, or I guess actually years now, because this dilemma in game design I feel is rampant. In the RPGification of video games, in the commonality of open world gameplay design, there's a tug of war between linear story design and non-linear gameplay, or systems-driven emergent gameplay being ponied up with scripted, predetermined narrative. That's largely what Nakey Jakey's video is about, and what stuck out most to me, besides this little bit with the Legos, was his point about how he was trying to get into this back room to interrupt this secret poker game or whatever. He thought he could parkour his way into the mission. He thought he could be creative, that he could use his own ingenuity to solve a problem. But spoilers, he couldn't. He had to do what the game wanted him to do. He had to follow a script. And so I've thought over the past 2 years, man, Nakey Jakey needs to play some Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons is vogue now. It's not some hobby you have to keep in a closet. There's a lot of reasons behind this. The immense popularity of Stranger Things, the easy rule set of 5th edition, the success of Critical Role in streaming D&D campaigns, or the generational cycle of parents who grew up playing with it in the 80s are now passing it on to their children. For all of these reasons, D&D is cool again. Big Hollywood stars talk about D&D, play D&D, and they're just unashamedly nerds, and it's awesome. But there's another reason why D&D has grown to be successful. There's an immemorial quality to this game of why it's endured through so many gaming fads over the past 3 decades. And that's because there isn't anything quite like it. D&D, to me, is nothing more than collaborative storytelling. It's sitting around a table with a group of friends, with a rulebook as a guide, and creativity and imagination at the forefront. It's something every gamer, that is, video gamer, needs to experience at least once in their life. And part of the reason why is because of this scene.
26.
Are you trying to counterspell?
I'll counterspell.
Okay.
Oh, shit. Never mind.
What level?
9.
Oh.
Oh!
Oh. That was pretty clutch.
That's right. You used your wish last night.
Well, that definitely works.
Critical Role is a bunch of nerdy-ass voice actors sitting around playing Dungeons and Dragons. And the first campaign followed a lot of the traditional story beats of fantasy and media that has kind of developed over the past 50 years. There are dragons, evil necromancers, ancient MacGuffins, and lovable, quirky heroes. The story culminated in a traditional, typical heroic fantasy climax. The heroes gotta fight the big bad evil guy to save the world. But the emotional climax came from this scene I showed you. One of the characters using a very decisive and important counterspell. If you're really interested in a full breakdown, there's this video by Matt Colville I'll link below, but for the purposes of us collectively now lobbying Nakey Jakey about why he should play Dungeons & Dragons, I'll give you just the spark notes. Sam Riegel's character is a culmination of a lot of little individual choices. He picked Bard as a class. He picked Counterspell as an ability as he progressed. He saved Counterspell for this moment. He used Counterspell in this moment. But also, one of his party members, Liam, also made a series of choices that led to this moment where the choice of using Counterspell or not would have ramifications, drastic ramifications, for his own character in his own story. Sam Riegel's character made a choice to defeat the big bad evil guy instead of saving a friend. This series of both mechanical and narrative decisions simply can't be replicated in video games, at least not yet. The class I pick in Pillars of Eternity does not change the emotional climax of the story. Whether I flirt or intimidate in Odyssey doesn't affect the outcome of the story. But in the world of Dungeons & Dragons, both big decisions, like the class I play, or seemingly innocuous ones, how I treat an NPC, can create this insane butterfly effect, and not just for me, but for everyone involved. In that sense, D&D rewards for what Nakey Jakey was trying to do. The experience is basically built on it. Everything you do in a D&D campaign can have a rippling effect that goes beyond of what you could possibly have considered. It's the biggest most bestest, most dynamic bin of Legos you could ever sink your hands into. Now, there are a few examples in video games that I can think of how you can dramatically impact the overall narrative of the game. However, there are even fewer where there is this kind of symbiotic relationship between how mechanical choice can influence narrative choice and vice versa. It's how me playing a wizard over a fighter, I've shifted the narrative future of this campaign unknowingly, and simultaneously, that narrative I'll experience in the next gaming session with my friends will in turn maybe influence what spells I pick, what feats I take, or skills I invest in, which will then in turn affect a story sequence or interaction with an NPC could play out months down the line. And so it goes back and forth. And this is really the core of D&D as a game and why it's so cool as a game. And RPGs and video games have not kept pace with this. There's a great video by Game Maker's Toolkit about the evolution of JRPGs, as well as an episode and Netflix documentary on the origin of video games' high score that discusses the impact of RPGs in the gaming space. And it's important to note that D&D was the key progenitor to video game RPGs, and thus modern day RPGs. But RPGs and video games have not really changed or reflected to how people play D&D now. People hear about Critical Role or NADPOD or Adventure Zone, and they can see how players can impact the narrative, stress out the DM, and create new choices and new stories in this unpredictable fashion. But RPG video games, like Nakey Jakey's criticism of Red Dead, don't mirror that. And how could they? It's almost impossible. Yet, there are a few examples of where it can kind of come into effect or come close. One of the video games that is probably most loaded with examples of this, and I'm totally open to hearing more by the way, is Divinity Original Sin 2. Playing an undead character can have a wildly different impact on the story. Making certain choices in a certain questline could kill certain NPCs that could affect skill books that might become unavailable, so you might choose a different skill set for your character. None of this is really on the same kind of earth-shattering level of D&D, but there are some. And also maybe the emotional climax with your love interest in Mass Effect 3, which is the kind of the second climax only to Anderson, can be a result of this kind of weird narrative mechanical cause and effect. You know, gender you pick, who you gravitate towards, who lives or who dies, and so forth. But a lot of the time, narrative choice affects narrative and gameplay choices affect gameplay. The choices you make in The Witcher 3 are impactful, but dialogue affects dialogue. Geralt, mechanically, is pretty predefined and devoid of narrative consequence when it comes to whether or not you pick bear armor, or you're an alchemy build, or you specialize in Igni over Ard, and so forth. None of that really changes how the story plays out. However, in D&D, it can change everything. Choices, creativity, imagination. As a dungeon master, when one of my players took a specific feat that I didn't even really know the full consequences of, they could identify a spell that led them to make a narrative assumption about an antagonist that created a completely new story arc in our experiences. Or one character kind of decided very flippantly that he was a theater major, and unbeknownst to them, an important NPC liked poetry and the stage, and so they forged a new relationship that helped them avoid an entire mechanical gameplay encounter and helped forge an entirely new one. So this is all kind of a plea to gamers everywhere, and maybe specifically to you, Mr. Jacob, to play at least once Dungeons & Dragons. If there was anything that resonated with you in his video from 2 years ago or this video right now, I strongly encourage you to give it a try. Pick up some dice, get nerdy, print out a character sheet, and play one of the best games video games are probably never, ever really going to truly replicate, at least for a long, long time. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I know with COVID going on, playing in person or even finding a group to play D&D with can be super tough. Thankfully, there are actually a ton of resources to help get you started. I've linked a bunch below, but feel free to leave a comment if you're looking for a play group. Maybe this little quest hub. Wow. Whew. Quest hub. I don't know. Anyways, maybe, we can help each other out in the comments and, help getting each other to roll some polyhedral dice. So roll those dice, baby. I'll see you guys soon.
Imagine, if you will, an ancient tome opening in a long-forgotten dusty library, the pages sweeping to the side. Ancient illuminated script in high Gothic font tells us of a story.